from the worst quarter where millions and millions, 25 million people over the course of the 4 years came into our country, many from prisons and gang members, drug dealers, mental institutions. They came into our country, getting them out. We have to get them out. Murderers, we have 11,888 murders. Many of them are now either out or in jail because they'll murder again. More than 50% of those people murdered more than one person. But we took a very strong stand, and people are really liking it. And by the way, drugs coming into our country by sea, down 94%. And I'm trying to figure out who the other 6% is, because frankly, I think they are they gotta be the bravest people. Who are the 6% that are still trying to come in? But
You just heard a man who holds more power than perhaps any figure in democratic governance speak with the casual brutality of someone ordering coffee, describe human beings as murderers, as drug dealers, as mental institution escapees, as bodies to be hunted, as problems to be solved with military precision and nationalistic fervor. And if your first reaction wasn't absolute visceral horror, then we need to have a very serious conversation about where we are as a civilization right now, because what we just witnessed wasn't a policy speech, but a masterclass in fascist dehumanization broadcast to millions as if it were perfectly normal political discourse. The Trump administration has been making arrests at roughly 1,100 people per day in recent weeks, with ICE arrests having soared since the start of his second term. And yet here he stands boasting about the bravest 6% of drug smugglers still trying to enter the country, turning mass incarceration and deportation into a sick punchline, while the vast majority of people being arrested have no criminal convictions, with data from June 2025 showing only 30% of those in detention had criminal convictions, and a mere 8.5% of those with criminal records were for violent offenses, which means everything he just said about murderers and gang members was a theatrical lie designed not to inform but to inflame, not to describe reality but to manufacture consent for atrocities yet to come. The numbers he cites are themselves propaganda instruments, and we need to dissect them with surgical precision, because ICE told Congress that as of July there were 435,000 unauthorized immigrants with criminal convictions in the United States who were not in custody, including 13,099 convicted of murder and 15,811 convicted of sexual assault. But notice what happens when you actually examine the enforcement priorities of this administration, because as of the end of May 2025, ICE had arrested only 752 non-citizens convicted of murder and 1,693 convicted of sexual assault, which tells us definitively that despite the blood-soaked rhetoric about hunting down the worst criminals, the vast deportation machine is actually sweeping up workers, families, students, people attending their immigration check-ins in good faith, because the truth that no one in power wants to acknowledge is that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are less likely to commit crimes than the U.S.-born, and as the immigrant share of the population grew from 6.2% in 1980 to 13.9% in 2022, the total crime rate dropped by 60.4%, which means every single word Trump just spoke was designed to invert empirical reality and replace it with a fever dream of brown menace and white victimhood. But here's where it gets genuinely terrifying, and this is what keeps me up at night, because Operation Charlotte's Web deployed hundreds of DHS and Border Patrol agents to North Carolina in mid-November, making sweeping arrests with officials billing it as targeting the worst criminals, yet more than 370 people were arrested and only 44 had any prior criminal record, according to DHS, revealing the crackdown is less about public safety than meeting political quotas. And when you understand that the administration has been pressuring ICE to hit arbitrary arrest numbers like some kind of dystopian sales target, with this year's arrest pace falling well short of the administration's goal of 3,000 arrests per day, as it promises to deport millions, with interior arrests fluctuating between 1,000 and 2,000 per day, despite being roughly double the Biden administration levels, you realize this isn't about criminality at all, but about raw numbers, about filling detention beds operated by private prison companies who donated millions to Trump-aligned PACs, about creating a spectacle of cruelty that satisfies a base addicted to the pornography of suffering inflicted on the racialized other. And let's talk about the historical echoes that should be making every single person with even a passing knowledge of 20th century European history break out in cold sweats, because Trump is following the same playbook as Eisenhower's 1954 operation 71 years later, having cited that operation during his campaign, and since then has repeatedly touted arrests on social media and daily deportation numbers echoing what the Eisenhower administration did to assure the public about clamping down on illegal immigration. But what no one wants to say out loud is that Operation Wetback, the actual historical name that reveals its racist DNA, involved military-style roundups that swept up American citizens of Mexican descent, created humanitarian catastrophes, and became a blueprint for state violence against entire communities based on perceived foreignness. Dehumanization reached one of its most extreme expressions under Nazi Germany, where it was systematically employed to justify persecution and extermination of various groups, with the Holocaust regarded as one of the most systematic and historically significant examples of atrocities carried out through sustained processes of dehumanization. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I draw this parallel, because fascist politics includes rhetoric that encourages fear and anger to foment division, with the goal of targeting ideological enemies, while dehumanizing segments of the population to reduce empathy and justify inhumane treatment, which is precisely the mechanism we just watched unfold in that clip. The language matters desperately here, because when Trump speaks of immigrants from prisons and gang members, drug dealers, mental institutions, he's engaging in what scholars call animalistic dehumanization, the combination of natural and metaphysical features that grounds one of the most vicious forms of racist ideologies, stripping people of their humanity by redefining them as contaminants, as invasive species, as pathologies requiring excision from the body politic rather than as human beings with stories and families and rights enshrined in international law that America theoretically recognizes. And when he jokes about the bravest 6% still trying to smuggle drugs, he's doing something even more insidious, because he's turning the exercise of state violence into entertainment, into a game show where the audience is invited to laugh along while human beings are hunted, and this normalization of cruelty through comedic framing is itself a fascist technique that makes the unthinkable acceptable by wrapping it in the language of casual banter. Now let's address the spectacular lie at the heart of his entire performance, because he claims drugs coming in by sea are down 94%, which, even if we accept that highly dubious statistic, tells us absolutely nothing about immigration policy, since most fentanyl enters the United States through ports of entry, with U.S. citizens being the primary smugglers, often recruited by criminal networks, meaning the entire framing conflates separate issues to manufacture a crisis that justifies militarized borders and mass detention, and the conflation is deliberate because it allows him to paint every migrant as a potential drug mule or cartel member, when the actual data shows the opposite. The intellectual dishonesty here is breathtaking in its scope, and we need to call it what it is, which is propaganda in service of a white nationalist vision that sees demographic change as existential threat and responds with state violence dressed up as law and order. But here's what should genuinely terrify anyone who understands how authoritarian movements consolidate power, because Trump has put his whole government toward mass deportation, with a playbook becoming standardized city after city, and Border Patrol and ICE go through areas where they think immigrants are living and arrest or pull over anyone they think looks undocumented. And the Supreme Court under Kavanaugh has already ruled that they can stop someone based on whether they seem undocumented, including considering their race, which is racial profiling enshrined in the highest court's jurisprudence, a legal framework that says it's acceptable to detain American citizens because they look foreign, because their skin is too brown, because they speak Spanish in public, because they exist in a body that doesn't conform to the nationalist fantasy of who belongs in America. The point is to be visible. They want us talking about it. They want immigrants to be afraid, because they know they can't arrest 11 million people, so they try to scare as many as possible out of living their lives in the hopes they'll self-deport, which reveals the strategy as one of terror, as psychological warfare waged against the most vulnerable, with the explicit goal of making America unlivable for anyone marked as foreign, regardless of their actual legal status. And we're seeing resistance emerge from unexpected places, because about 135 people gathered in Boone, North Carolina, holding signs reading "Nazis were just following orders too," and chanting profane rebukes at ICE agents, with Operation Charlotte's Web arresting more than 370 people, but only 44 with prior criminal records. And what's fascinating and hopeful is that this crackdown is facing fierce pushback not only in liberal hubs, but in predominantly white working-class communities, with the resistance in places like Boone signaling that America's political fault lines are shifting, because even in communities that voted for Trump, people are recognizing that when ICE shows up and starts arresting their neighbors, their co-workers, the people who helped rebuild after hurricanes, the abstractions of campaign rhetoric collide with the human reality of state violence, and suddenly the moral calculus changes. The administration keeps claiming they're targeting criminals, but CNN reported internal ICE statistics showing less than 10% of immigrants in ICE custody since October 2024 had criminal offenses, with internal documents suggesting officials are not focused on violent criminals, and Cato Institute data showing 65% detained by IC had no criminal convictions, with 93% having no violent convictions, which means Trump just stood there and lied with the confidence of someone who knows his base doesn't care about facts because the narrative of immigrant criminality serves a deeper psychological need. It provides an acceptable target for economic anxiety and cultural displacement. It offers simple answers to complex problems, and most dangerously, it constructs a permission structure for violence by defining an entire class of people as inherently threatening and therefore deserving of whatever befalls them. The surveillance state dimensions are genuinely Orwellian in their scope, because Project 2025 requires local law enforcement to hold migrants for DHS or lose federal funding while mandating total information sharing, giving the federal government access to state databases, and Trump is following through on a Project 2025 policy calling for federal law enforcement to investigate and potentially criminally prosecute local authorities who refuse to cooperate with mass deportation plans, which he implemented through executive order on his first day in office, which represents a fundamental assault on federalism and local autonomy, the federal government threatening to prosecute mayors and governors who refuse to turn their police departments into immigration enforcement arms. And this is how authoritarianism works. It doesn't announce itself with jackboots and armbands, but through the gradual erosion of institutional independence, until every lever of government serves a singular ideological vision. The private prison profiteering angle makes me want to scream into the void, because Geo Group donated $1 million to Trump-aligned PAC MAGA Inc. in 2024, with ICE acting director Tom Homan being a paid consultant to the firm prior to joining the administration. And deportations are a lucrative business with billions spent annually in detaining people, with Wall Street Journal reporting enforcement and removal operations alone costing $4.5 billion in fiscal year 2023, and military planes used for deportations costing over $850,000 per flight, which means there's an entire industry with massive financial incentives to ensure the deportation machine keeps running at maximum capacity. Corporations extracting wealth from human suffering while lobbying for policies that guarantee a steady supply of bodies to warehouse and process. And this is neoliberal cruelty at its most distilled, the privatization of state violence for profit maximization. Trump's rhetoric about knowing every route and every house should send chills down every spine because it's surveillance state language. It's the assertion of panoptic power that sees all and can reach anyone. And when combined with his promise to get them out, we're witnessing the rhetorical groundwork for what could become the largest forced population movement in modern American history. ICE deported nearly 200,000 people in the first 7 months of Trump's administration, still short of his stated goal, with Trump having campaigned on mass deportation, vowing that removing undocumented immigrants would be top priority with a goal of 1 million deportations a year, and the logistical infrastructure being built to achieve this includes ICE receiving nearly $75 billion through 2029, including about $45 billion specifically to increase capacity at immigration detention centers, with another $30 billion toward enforcement and removal directed toward arresting immigrants and transporting them to detention centers, which represents a staggering investment in the machinery of deportation, resources that could address housing, healthcare, education, climate adaptation, but instead are being funneled into a system designed to identify, capture, warehouse, and expel millions of human beings. What we're witnessing is the construction of what Hannah Arendt would recognize as radical evil, the bureaucratic normalization of cruelty at scale, where the machinery of state operates with cold efficiency to categorize humans as problems requiring administrative solutions, and the banality of evil manifests not in dramatic pronouncements but in spreadsheets tracking arrest quotas and flight manifests for military deportation operations and detention center capacity expansions. Students active in campus protests opposing Israel's war in Gaza have been individually targeted for visa revocation and status termination, with Tufts graduate student arrested by masked men in plainclothes after her status was revoked on grounds her continued presence might undermine U.S. foreign policy. Which reveals how the deportation apparatus can be weaponized against political dissent, how immigration status becomes a cudgel to silence speech and punish advocacy, and suddenly we're in territory where the line between immigration enforcement and political repression dissolves entirely. The economic devastation that mass deportation would cause is staggering because construction, manufacturing, agriculture, service and childcare are among sectors that employ large numbers of illegal immigrants, with economist Adam Tooze saying the planned deportations would cause a series of rolling shocks to a large part of the U.S. economy, and the American Immigration Council estimated the cost of conducting 1 million deportations at $967.9 billion in federal government spending over a decade, which means the economic case against mass deportation is overwhelming. But that doesn't matter, because this was never about economic rationality, but about satisfying a base that derives psychological satisfaction from witnessing the infliction of suffering on racialized others, about performing dominance and reclaiming imagined status through the ritual humiliation and removal of those deemed unworthy of belonging. And we have to understand the international dimensions here, because when Trump talks about getting them out and knowing every route, he's describing a transnational enforcement regime that requires cooperation from countries throughout Latin America, and nearly 14 million U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents live in households where at least one member is unauthorized, with nearly 1 in 3 Latino families faced with the threat of removal or family separation, which means millions of American citizens, including children born on U.S. soil, are living under the constant psychological terror that their parent or sibling or spouse could be taken at any moment, could disappear into the deportation pipeline, and end up thousands of miles away. And this is what state terror looks like in a constitutional democracy. It's the fear that permeates entire communities, the reluctance to go to work or school, or the hospital or the police, because any interaction with official institutions could trigger a chain of events ending in separation and deportation. The comparisons to historical fascism are not rhetorical flourishes, but necessary scholarly frameworks for understanding the political moment we inhabit, because fascist politics includes creation of a mythical past of purity of religion, race and culture, a time of glory lost due to humiliation brought on by globalism, with values like equality having made the nation weak, and propaganda is an important tool of fascist politics, using language of virtuous ideals to unite people behind objectionable ends, with propaganda working best when confined to a few points and slogans, and simple language, which is exactly what Trump is doing when he reduces complex immigration dynamics to murderers and gang members and getting them out, 3-word phrases that bypass rational deliberation and appeal directly to fear and tribal allegiance. Fascists believe nature imposes hierarchies inconsistent with equality, with hierarchies standard within fascism, most importantly us over them, believing natural hierarchies of worth exist, which is the metaphysical foundation of everything Trump just articulated, the belief that some people simply matter more than others, based on where they were born and what passport they carry, and how closely their appearance conforms to white supremacist ideals of American belonging. But here's what gives me hope even as I rage against the machinery of oppression, because as early as April 2025, multiple polls found that the majority of Americans thought deportations went too far, and grassroots resistance is emerging in unexpected places, and there are lawyers filing lawsuits, and judges in Chicago and D.C. ordering releases because arrests were conducted without warrants, and sanctuary cities refusing to cooperate despite federal threats, and neighbors forming rapid response networks. And this is how you resist fascism, not through grand gestures but through thousands of small acts of solidarity and refusal, through making the machinery of deportation so expensive and difficult and legally fraught that it cannot function at the scale required to achieve its stated goals. The moral imperative here could not be clearer, because we're at a hinge point in American democracy, where we either collectively decide that human rights matter regardless of legal status, or we embrace a vision of America as a blood and soil ethnostate, where belonging is determined by race and nativity and proximity to power. Every person of conscience has a role to play in this struggle, and that role begins with refusing to normalize what we just witnessed, refusing to accept the premise that some humans are reducible to categories like murderer or illegal, refusing to look away as our government constructs the infrastructure for industrial-scale human rights violations while wrapping it in the flag and calling it law and order. What Trump described in that clip wasn't policy but a promise of suffering, a commitment to use the full weight of the state to hunt and capture and remove millions of people whose only crime in many cases was crossing an invisible line in desperate search of safety or opportunity. And the applause that likely greeted his words in whatever arena he was performing in should haunt us, because it reveals how far we've traveled down the road toward authoritarian cruelty, how effectively the propaganda has worked to convince millions that their economic anxiety and cultural displacement can be solved through the organized violence of mass deportation. This is the test of our generation, whether we have the moral courage to say no, to throw sand in the gears, to protect our neighbors, to remember that history will judge us not by our stated values, but by our actions when those values were tested by the seductive promises of fascism wrapped in patriotic bunting and delivered with a smirk about the bravest 6%. And if we fail this test, there may not be another chance to get it right.